I live in one of those neighborhoods with houses that are millimeters apart, lawns trimmed with a ruler, and white fences so sterile they look like they came out of a plastic surgery catalog. And as could not be missing from this scenario of forced perfection, we have one of those neighborhood associations, the famous HOA, that thinks it's the neighborhood's own FBI. They patrol the streets as if they were on a war mission, ready to issue fines for anything that deviates a millimeter from the standard. A plant out of place? Fine. A car parked slightly askew? Fine. A doormat that's too colorful? A fine and looks of collective disapproval. That was the artificial paradise I was living in when I decided to hire Reynaldo. An exceptional guy. Discreet, hard-working, even too kind for the amount of beating he could take. Reynaldo is black, and that was never a detail for me. But for certain people around here, it was as if he had been born with a neon sign flashing "Threat" above his head. The neighbor from across the street, a starched blonde, always frowning as if she smelled sewage where there was only clean air, soon showed her claws. The first sign was subtle, like a note left in my mailbox. Attention, strange people circulating on the property. The safety of the community depends on everyone's vigilance. It wasn't even signed, but you could smell the scent of hypocrisy and racism evaporating from the paper. Reynaldo had barely started working with me, and his wife was already in panic mode, as if he were a fugitive from the 6 o'clock news. But the pinnacle was really when she called the police. Yes, the police. On any given Tuesday, the sun was shining, the birds were singing, and Reynaldo was simply tending to his garden as he did every week. He was pruning some rose bushes when 2 cars arrived with their sirens off, but looking like they were hoping to catch someone red-handed. And for what reason? Because a suspicious man was hanging around a property. I swear I was so indignant that for a second I thought I'd walked into a hidden camera. Reynaldo was calmer than me, as always. He explained everything, showed his badge, and pointed to my name on the service contract. The policeman, visibly embarrassed, left without so much as an apology. But the neighbor, who was watching everything from her window with a glass of wine in her hand, as if she were watching a live episode of Justiça Feita, seemed satisfied, as if she had fulfilled her civic duty to maintain order. It ate me up inside, not just because of the gratuitous humiliation Reynaldo suffered, but because of the kind of world it revealed. A world where a black man in uniform with pruning shears in his hand is treated as a threat, while the real plague of the neighborhood, malicious gossip, polite prejudice, toxic surveillance, passes as exemplary janitors. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about everything. The hypocrisy of the neighborhood, the plastered structure of the HOA, the passivity of the other families who, even realizing the absurdity, preferred not to get involved, and especially Reynaldo, who arrived the next day as if nothing had happened, gave me a sincere good morning and carried on with his work. That's when an idea came to me, one of those ideas that start as a whisper but grow into a shout. I knew that the HOA was going to have an election soon, something that nobody really cared about, because the same people were always re-elected among themselves, maintaining the cycle of control and pettiness. But this time, I was going to get involved. And not only that, I was going to put Reynaldo at the center of it all. He was going to be my candidate, my change, not for the revenge itself, but for the symbol, for breaking the system, for the poetic irony of seeing the woman who denounced him for looking suspicious, having to live under the rules of the man she tried to humiliate. And so, the plan began. Starting a riot against the HOA isn't like picking a bar fight. There are no broken bottles, no shouting. It's worse. It's silent, full of fake smiles, whispered votes, and backroom deals more worthy of a Mexican soap opera than a neighborhood association. But I was willing, not for the pleasure of the mess, but because that woman needed a lesson. Not an angry or impulsive lesson, but one that is served cold, with refinement, elegance, and a slight touch of debauchery. The first part of the plan was to convince Rinaldo, and, as expected, he thought I was joking. He laughed, shook his head, and let out that typical, "You're crazy." But I insisted. I told him what they had done, the absurdity of the complaint, the clownishness of that police patrol in the middle of the day, the audacity of the neighbor who thought she was the sheriff of a neighborhood that barely knows how to wash its own sidewalks. And I told him about my plan, calmly, explaining that he wouldn't be alone, that I would take care of the bureaucracy, help with the paperwork, the speeches, whatever. Ultimately, I think what convinced Reynaldo wasn't even the idea of becoming president of the HOA. It was the way I spoke, like someone who can no longer accept seeing a friend treated like dirt because of the color of their skin, like someone who wants to turn the tables with class, and also, perhaps, a little for the taste of irony. Because Reynaldo, even though he was discreet, had this sarcastic side. This contained pleasure in turning the tables without making a fuss. With the candidacy launched, I began to move behind the scenes. The HOA, like any association that takes itself too seriously, had archaic rules, a set of bylaws, and a tradition of natural candidates who were really the same 3 or 4 residents with too much free time and an inflated sense of authority. But nobody expected someone like Rinaldo to enter the game, and that's exactly what gave me the edge. I started talking to the younger neighbors, those who were already fed up with the ridiculous rules, people who had been fined for leaving their kayaks in the yard for 2 hours, couples who had been reprimanded for planting very exotic flowers, a guy who was warned because his dog barked too much on a Saturday afternoon, people who had accumulated sorrow and just needed a pretext to rebel. And Reynaldo became that pretext. I used the neighborhood's WhatsApp with mastery. I created subtle messages, nothing aggressive, just suggesting that maybe it was time to change things up a bit, that a fresh look would be good, that someone outside the traditional circle could bring real solutions. And people began to respond, first with emojis, then with longer messages, and suddenly there was a group. Of course, the woman across the street didn't stand idly by. When she heard about Rinaldo's candidacy, probably through some gossip from her husband, who was one of the old board members, she had a hissy fit. Literally, she had the audacity to walk past my house and say, "We have to protect the community loud enough for everyone to hear," as if we were being invaded by a group of barbarians, and Reynaldo was their leader. But with each attempt to block his candidacy, it sank further. They tried to claim that he wasn't a resident. Ridiculous. The bylaws allowed anyone involved in maintaining the neighborhood and providing ongoing services to run for office. Then, they tried to use the excuse that he didn't attend the monthly meetings. Ironic, coming from people who never even let him into the event hall. It was like complaining that someone doesn't dance at a party from which they were barred at the door. And even in the face of all this resistance, Reynaldo stood firm, discreet, as always, elegant even. He didn't get involved in discussions, he didn't lower himself to provocations. He let me and the others deal with the attacks, while he prepared himself. He studied the HOA regulations as if they were a code of war. He identified the absurd clauses, proposed real ideas. No empty promises, just common sense. The campaign became a talking point on street corners, at barbecues, at school parents' meetings, and the best thing, without Rinaldo having to make a fuss, no gaudy posters, no shouting, just presence, just firmness, just the silent certainty that he deserved to be there. And the more he grew, the more the neighbor freaked out. She started printing anonymous flyers, spreading rumors, even trying to dig up one of his traffic tickets from years ago as if it were a scandal. Pathetic. A perfect portrait of a woman desperate to keep control of a territory she thought was hers alone. But the neighborhood was changing. Maybe not completely, maybe not so fast, but it was. And there, in that cauldron of hypocrisy and millimetric pruning, a small revolution was being born. A silent, discreet one, but full of meaning. And I, who had started it all as an act of ironic revenge, no longer saw it that way. It had become something else, a battle for dignity, for justice, for space, and above all, a way of showing that even the best-tended gardens hide rotten roots, and that sometimes the only way to save the soil is to plant it all over again. Election Day came as a kind of messianic event, not because of its real weight, but because of what it represented. It was just the choice of the new president of the Residents' Association, but in that neighborhood addicted to appearance, it seemed as if we were choosing the new world leader. And deep down, for that woman in particular, it was just that. It was as if the world she knew was under threat of being swallowed up by a wave of common sense, diversity, and humanity. The HOA General Meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening because, obviously, absurd decisions can only be made when everyone is already tired from work, in a bad mood, and dreaming of bed. I knew it was going to be a dirty game. They weren't going to let it go, and they really didn't. The first thing they tried was to delay the start of the meeting due to technical problems. Nobody knew for sure what these problems were, but the current president, a guy with the charisma of a door and the excitement of a sleepy slug, kept going around saying that the projector wasn't working, as if a projector was needed to decide between two names. Ridiculous. Meanwhile, the woman, dressed in a blue suit that screamed, "I'm in charge here," paraded around the hall with a frozen smile on her face, as if she was already celebrating a victory that hadn't even happened. Some people came up to her, whispered, laughed, said hello with that pat on the shoulder, typical of those who think they're on the right side of history. I watched from afar, almost bored, like someone who has already read the end of the book and is just waiting for the others to catch up. When they finally decided to start, it was after 8 o'clock. And then came the theatrics. The current president opened the meeting with an empty speech about unity and community values, as if he were reading a self-help manual bought in a drugstore promotion. Then he listed the HOA's achievements over the past year: painting the curb, moving the trash can, a new rule about the size of clotheslines. Truly life-changing achievements. When it was the candidate's turn to speak, Ronaldo stood up slowly. He was wearing a simple, unostentatious dress shirt. He didn't want to impress anyone with his appearance, because he already did that with his presence. And when he began to speak, there was no fuss, just an honest explanation of why he was there. He talked about the absurd rules, the lack of representation, the need to listen to everyone, not just those who have the free time and the right skin to run the meetings. He didn't shout. He didn't point fingers. He didn't talk about the woman who had called the police. He didn't say a word about racism or prejudice, or put himself forward as a victim. And yet, it was all there, in the way he looked people in the eye, in the pause between one sentence and the next, in the firm voice of someone who knows what it's like to be treated as invisible by people who pretend not to see. After him came the other candidate, a man who had already been president twice, whose only argument was basically, "I've always been here, so I should stay here." The audience yawned in unison. They seemed more interested in the dry cookies on the table than in the old man's words. Voting began soon after, with ballots distributed by hand, because digitizing anything there was considered daring. And that's when the tension really set in. The woman stood near the ballot box like a sentinel, watching each person who voted with half-closed eyes, trying to guess their intentions. Ronaldo, for his part, moved away, went to the back of the room and stood quietly, as if to say, without saying it, "Vote as you like. I've already won, just by being here." The votes were counted on a makeshift table, with a ceiling fan creaking above, and 3 members of the current board whispering numbers and writing them down on a yellowed clipboard. The suspense was almost comical. One of them, visibly nervous, dropped a ballot and was scolded by the other, who wore a bow tie and looked like a retired accountant frustrated at never having been a Supreme Court justice. And then came the result. Reynaldo won, handily. It wasn't a narrow victory, it wasn't a surprise, it was a message, the kind that don't need to be shouted. The woman paled, literally. Her frozen smile melted slowly, like a candle forgotten in the sun. She tried to cover it up, of course. She applauded with that protocol clap, almost ironic, but her eyes screamed. People stood up, shook Reynaldo's hand. Some even smiled. There were hugs. Comments like, "Finally," and "This is change," echoed around the hall. The energy was different. You could almost feel the air less heavy, as if the neighborhood had taken a deep breath after years of holding its breath. And of course, the next day, the woman put up a giant American flag on the balcony. Because when certain types feel threatened, they appeal to patriotism like a blanket. It was her way of saying, "I'm still here," even though inside she knew she was losing ground. But the funniest thing was her new behavior with Reynaldo, a mixture of feigned politeness and bottled-up resentment. I greeted him with a swallowed "good morning," avoided eye contact, changed the sidewalk when he approached. I didn't give orders anymore. I didn't make remarks. And above all, I didn't call the police anymore. Because now, if she did, she'd have to justify it to the HOA president himself. And that was just delicious. The neighborhood changed. Not magically, not overnight, but it did change. Rules were revised. Pointless fines began to be questioned. Residents who had previously been invisible began to show up at meetings. And Reynaldo? He stayed the same. Calm, firm, without having to raise his voice to command. Because real leadership isn't imposed. It's conquered. And he conquered every square meter of that place with dignity. And me? I just watched. Proud. A little surprised, even. Because the plan, which was born as an ironic punch in the face of hypocrisy, had turned into a lesson in humanity. And in the end, the real lesson wasn't just for the woman, it was for all of us. Time passed, and with it, the irony of the situation became routine. Reynaldo became such a natural figure at HOA meetings that even the most resistant had stopped frowning when he opened his mouth. It was funny to see how quickly everything fell into place. People who used to avoid even looking at him now made a point of calling him by his name, sometimes even with a certain exaggeration, like someone trying to make up for years of neglect with belated kindnesses. The woman, of course, didn't buy it. Not a chip. She made a point of maintaining a posture of silent resistance, as if she were living under some oppressive regime. She turned her house into a shrine of resistance to common sense. Flags, "Respect the rules" signs in the garden. Even a sign hanging on the fence saying, "Beware, angry dog," and owner even more so. Not that anyone cared. It was just one more eccentricity among many. The neighborhood learned to live with her bad mood like someone who learns to ignore the hum of an old refrigerator. It's there. It bothers a bit, but it's not worth the effort of fixing. The most curious thing was how much Reynaldo annoyed without doing anything at all. He wasn't authoritarian. He didn't invent new rules. He didn't persecute anyone. On the contrary, he started by repealing some ridiculous rules, such as the ban on colored doormats and the obligation to paint the fences white once a year. Simple things, but they opened up space for a lighter coexistence. He installed a community bench in the square, created a discussion group with residents on the app, and even organized a plant exchange day. No big deal, but enough to deeply irritate those who thought the neighborhood should remain a 50s magazine catalog. The woman, feeling the power slipping through her fingers, tried to get back on the attack. She started attending meetings, but only to write down every word that was said, as if she were collecting material for a secret dossier. On one occasion, he accused Reynaldo of imposing changes without consulting everyone. He replied calmly, pointing out that all the changes had been voted through, with an overwhelming majority, in fact. The other day, she tried to provoke him by saying that the neighborhood was losing the standard that made it special. Reynaldo just smiled and replied that perhaps the pattern was precisely the problem. It was this kind of response that disarmed anyone, because it didn't come with anger or open irony. It was just the naked truth, and that hurt more than any scream. Before long, she began to isolate herself. Some of her former allies drifted away, perhaps realizing that they were on the wrong side of history. Others simply got tired of the constant bitterness, and she, used to being listened to, began to be ignored. She started writing letters, long letters, neatly folded, left in the HOA mailbox, imaginary denunciations, complaints about the type of music played in the square, about children playing ball, about neighbors who laughed too loudly. The letters were read, of course, out of obligation, and then, with all due respect, filed away in the same drawer where irrelevant concerns end up. There was one last dramatic attempt to block Reynaldo's re-election. She showed up at the meeting with a stack of printed papers, citing rules in the bylaws that, according to her, would prevent someone without registered property from holding office. Reynaldo listened patiently. When she finished her monologue, he stood up and said that, in fact, he wasn't the owner, but that, 2 days earlier, I had officially given him the deed to the house. Yes, I did. I signed it, notarized it, and everything. Because I could, because I wanted to, and because few things would give me more pleasure than to see the look of shock on her face at that moment. She left the room without saying a word, not a sigh, just the sound of heels hitting the floor, like the dry hammering of someone trying to maintain the dignity that had already slipped out the back door. He never showed up at any meeting again. No letter, no complaint, no sarcastic comments in the square. He just disappeared. And honestly, nobody missed him. Reynaldo was re-elected with even more votes than before. And this time, there was no opposition, no challenger, no alternative name, just him. A man who, once before, had been accused of looking suspicious for tending a garden. Now, he set the rules, who listened to the residents, who made sure that everyone, absolutely everyone, had a voice. Sometimes he still asks me if it's all gone too far, if I don't regret having started this story, and I can only laugh, because deep down, what we did was more than overturn a rotten structure. We exposed its absurdity. We forced that place to look in the mirror, and the truth is that despite all the clean facades, the cut grass, and the identical houses, that neighborhood needed a good mess to learn how to really live. In the end, Reynaldo didn't just become president of the HOA, he became a symbol of the patience that endures, of the elegance that confronts without shouting, and of the certainty that sometimes the best response to an attack is a calm smile, followed by a well-delivered retort. And best of all, he's still president today, and he will continue to be, because now the neighborhood has understood there are people who deserve to be in charge, and there are people who urgently need to learn to be commanded. And if you liked it, don't forget to leave your like and comment below.